Hello, everyone. So, today I would like to talk about OCD and particularly my experience with OCD. I would like to also say that this video is going to alternate between two focal points of my experience. One of them is more of a neutral stance, which comes from my formal academic pursuit of neuroscience. So, I will also discuss OCD in terms of its neurobiology and what it is. But I won't get too technical with this video. If you guys want to, I can do a separate video where I will technically discuss the neurobiology behind OCD. In this video, I would like to share more of my personal experience, what OCD has been for me, what things have I done that have been pretty helpful in all of this. And so hopefully you will find this video useful. I believe that it is also always a worthwhile pursuit to share one's vulnerability because, speaking from experience, sometimes all you need is to hear someone saying that they are going through something similar to what you are. And so hopefully this video is able to do that for some of you guys. So in my specific case, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, was diagnosed relatively recently, around 8 months ago, but it is something that has been present all my life. It just wasn't diagnosed before. I struggled with periods of depression and anxiety, and even though I sought help for it, it was never fully diagnosed that my case was OCD. And for those of you guys who don't know what OCD is, normally OCD is about having an intrusive thought, which is normally ego-dystonic, so it goes against your values. And they can be extremely scary. They can be, just something that fully goes against your values, and it just is able to latch onto some uncertainties that you might have. And in response to that, you act in some compulsive manner, so you do a compulsion. Normally, when people talk about OCD, they think about washing hands, they talk about physical compulsions, and although that might be the case for a lot of people, OCD isn't just that. A lot of times people forget about the obsessive part of OCD, which is, you have an obsession about a certain topic in which you cannot accept not even the tiniest bit of uncertainty. And so, because you're not able to accept that uncertainty, you are continuously running in circles, adopting various rituals and strategies to not accept that uncertainty. And in my case, I never had physical compulsions. So, and for a lot of people, this is also true. It is called pure OCD, pure O. And this is when your OCD is mostly focused on the obsessive part and where most of your compulsions are mental. And mental compulsions are things such as rumination, certainty seeking. So imagine I will discuss my case. I've had various themes throughout my OCD, although I think the main one has been existential and health OCD. But this is also something that isn't discussed a lot in OCD circles, which is that you don't necessarily have to have just one theme. There is also always the possibility of there being some variability in your themes along your lifetime, depending on what period you are on. And a lot of times when you get a hold on one of your themes, the other one just pops out. So that's also part of the process. But in my case, when I look back, my OCD started around when I was 13, when I experienced for the first time, or maybe I was 12, when I experienced for the first time a huge bout of anxiety, panic. And I was going through a hard period in my life where I had just recently lost my mother, and my mother was sick for a long time with cancer, and I did not know about this. My family tried to protect me from this fact, and so when she died and I found out that she had been sick for much of my childhood and I just did not know it, I think a threat detection switch turned on, and I was like, if something so big had just occurred right under my nose, then it might be the case that I might be completely wrong about what I deem as being real, what I deem as being true. And so I think that created a possibility in my mind that I could just be completely mistaken about the things that I took for granted. And so I think that might have been that trauma was probably the beginning of my OCD. And at first, my OCD was mostly around health issues. So because I was struggling a lot with anxiety, and I had these heart palpitations, which are very common, with the experience of being anxious, I would have these really intrusive thoughts and worries that I could not let go of. What if I have a heart issue? What if, there's something really wrong with me physically? I also felt what I know now to be depersonalization. So I kind of felt a little out of it, a little bit distanced. The world just didn't seem as it used to. It's kind of, if you're looking to the world through, some goggles that kind of distort what you are perceiving, it's kind of a difficult experience to describe unless you have gone through depersonalization. But looking back now, I can identify that was what was going on. And so I had these experiences which I wasn't familiar with, that I really had no mental tools to. And I didn't, I was afraid of asking for help. I was afraid of going to a therapist, to a psychologist. I was, for some reason, the mental stigma was very present at the time. I didn't want my friends to discover that I was going to therapy, because that would mean that I was crazy or I had something wrong with me. And the funny part about all of that is that a lot of us were kind of trying to hide that we had these issues, and a lot of us were going actually to therapy and seeking mental health treatments, and we kept this from one another. So all of us were suffering in silence, because it's not the same for most people. It's not the same as telling that you're going to the dentist, because since it's your mental health, you feel that it is far more intimate, and so you don't want to share it. But disregarding that, I was facing all of these thoughts, these worries, these sensations. I was essentially experiencing something that I could not conceptually get a grasp of. I just thought that, there was some issue with my brain or my body that for some reason I could not let go of these questions. In that first episode that actually lasted for months, I think once my OCD started, it never truly went away. The obsessive part was triggered and it just never truly went away, although the heightened periods of anxiety did experience an ebb and flow. Sometimes this was also related to stressors that I had going on in my life. My OCD patterns would increase if I was being stressed out, or if I wasn't sleeping much, or if I just had something come up. And for my first episode, which was mostly under the theme of health anxiety, afraid of, having cancer, afraid of going blind, afraid of developing any wide array of diseases, having a heart attack, be it what it is. And I would watch a lot of Dr. House episodes, and I would search the net for symptoms, WebMD, all of that stuff, and that would just perpetuate the cycle of worry. That lasted on for a while. After the acute episodes of anxiety, I kind of stabilized, and I was able to sort of go back to the way I was, although that obsessive thinking, that background anxiety, that heightened baseline level of anxiety never truly went away. And especially because, and this is true for a lot of OCD and mental health disorders, most of them occur during childhood or early adolescence, because this is the time in your life where neuroplasticity is at its highest. So you're very vulnerable to experience. Your brain is very malleable, and this can result in adaptive or maladaptive changes. And so, like I was saying, that theme of OCD lasted for a long time until around 3 years later, I was under a lot of pressure in school. I wanted to get good grades. I just became obsessed with, I just became really afraid of not having sufficiently good grades to not have a promising future. I was thinking that I wasn't good enough. And so there was also this level of depression, which was also attached to my OCD. And this is, of course, sometimes I hear and I see diagnoses which are where people bundle a lot of different mental health disorders on top of each other, such as, I have OCD and I have depression and then I have generalized anxiety disorder. And that might be helpful as a label, but it would be very strange if you had OCD and you did not experience any sort of depression or anxiety or even some level of attention deficit disorder, because you're so immersed in your own thoughts that OCD isn't just, the intrusive thoughts. It isn't just a thinking problem. It's also a feeling problem where you are just deeply engulfed in all of these experiences and very strong physical sensations. And so, like I was saying, 3 years down the road, I had a panic attack while I was studying. And these questions that I really hadn't been exposed to before, I wasn't really the type of kid that was very deep into philosophy or very deep into, these kind of questions. 2 questions just came up in my mind. One of them was, how do I know if anything is real? And the other was, how do I know if I exist? Those 2 questions just came out of nowhere. And from the first moment that they appeared, a huge rush of anxiety just popped up. I entered into a full panic attack because as soon as the questions came up, especially for the first question of how do I know if anything is real, my mind quickly realized that I did not have a way of knowing whether anything was real. Because it's one of those questions that, philosophers have struggled through millennia, it's a part of our own human experience. And so my brain very quickly figured out that I was not equipped to answer that question. And as someone who enjoyed very much to have control over his environment, over his own mind, and saw the world kind of in a black and white manner, these kind of questions kind of exploded in my mind. I was just, completely in a state of just deep fear. I was afraid of even telling anyone about this. I was afraid that I would be classified as going as crazy, as completely out of his mind. And I ended up asking for help soon after this. But I was terrified of seeing a psychologist after this event. I was so scared of telling them that I was going through this. I just wished and prayed of just having a normal cause for anxiety or a normal cause for depression. I wished that what I was dealing with was a relationship problem or was a self-confidence problem. And so just going up to someone and telling them that what scares you is these bigger than life questions, these questions that really no one can answer and probably will never answer. It just seems like they are too overwhelming to even try to engage with. And so from that moment on, all of these existential questions about what is reality, how do I know if I'm not the only one in my reality? How do I know if I'm not hallucinating or in a dream? All of those versions of the same question, which at its root is, how do I know anything, just started popping up. The simulation problem, all of that. All of that just started popping up, and it was extremely scary because the sensation of dealing with all of these existential questions is that the life around you continues the same, people demand the same from you, but you just feel like the world is completely wrong, and you are just, in some sense, you are in disbelief of how those around you are not thinking about the same thing. You just feel completely alone. You feel that you're the only one in the world struggling with these questions. You feel that you are stuck in this solipsism nightmare and no one is going to take you out of it. And in my case, my compulsion was definitely avoidance. I would avoid at all costs any sort of philosophical discussion. Any movie that was related to this topic, I would not watch. So Matrix, Shutter Island, Inception, all of those movies, I was completely unable to watch them at all. And so this pattern of thinking, these existential questions for a very long time, even though I was doing therapy, I was doing talk therapy at the time, I was able to improve a lot in terms of I was able to have periods where I was okay. I was able to sort of live with these questions, although I was far from what I had been in terms of functionality, in terms of being able to focus, work, study. That was sort of far from the level that I had experienced in the past. But I still continued with the compulsion of avoidance, and I was constantly thinking about how I could prove that, for instance, what I was perceiving was real. I would be continuously stuck in these loops of trying to figure out all of these questions, and that brought a lot of suffering, a lot of confusion, and I would just not be able to have a neutral stance towards any of these questions. Later on, I was just completely engulfed in these questions. I had a life event which was very difficult to handle at the time. I was going through a lot of changes in my life. And in the midst of those changes and anxiety, because they were so overwhelming, it's as if my brain kind of forgot about these existential questions. And so my brain kind of did a reset. And especially at that time, because I was feeling so anxious and so depressed, I started meditating and I started reading about Eastern contemplative traditions. And this was extremely helpful because I just had a brain reset and now I was installing a new software which ended up in a way but providing me, of course, with some framework to deal with some of the existential questions that I had. It was very interesting that one of the main things that popped out when I started reading about contemplative traditions, Eastern contemplative traditions such as Buddhism, was this idea of the self-illusion, that identity is a construct. And, this was a theme that when I was in the midst of existential thoughts, that I was completely scared of. If someone were to tell me that the self is an illusion, that identity is a construct, that would terrify me. But after I had gone that kind of brain reset and I touched upon those topics, I was, I just became it gave me a sense of tranquility, the self-illusion idea, because through mindfulness, which I started practicing daily and reading a lot about Eastern contemplative tradition. And at the time, I was also starting my path into neuroscience and psychology. All of that just gave me a mental flexibility and a new way of viewing the world that replaced fear with anxiety. And after I started doing those practices and reading things and seeing things that I was completely unable to watch previously, I was, without knowing, doing exposure therapy. I was exposing myself to things that really did scare me before, but now for some reason I found them really interesting. And so these philosophical questions that used to torment me, they just became extremely interesting. And so I was looking back, I was like, this is amazing. How did this happen? How is it that the same question has a completely different valence to it than it had before? This was extremely surprising for me. And this period lasted on for around 3 years. 3 years in which I was the most productive that I had ever been in my life. I was doing a lot of different things. I was podcasting, I was working, I was studying at the same time. I even ended up doing 2 master's degrees at the same time. And, I just felt well. I just felt like I was far more resilient and flexible than I was before. I also need to mention that at the beginning of those 3 years, when I went through those big life changes and I experienced that big anxiety that reset my brain, it is important for me to mention that at that time I started medication. I started taking an SSRI, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so an antidepressant. And when I started taking it, it took a while in order to start working, but the combination of the SSRI, meditation, a lot of physical exercise, and this new interest in the world, this new way of viewing the world was extremely transformative. And I had those 3 years. I took the SSRI for around 1 year, and I got off it with no problems. And then I had 2 good years after that. But around 8 months ago, and even before that, I was going through a period where once again I started having a lot of stuff going wrong in my life. So my thesis work, my research was going to shit. It just became a huge nightmare. I had all of this. I had this plan for my life that I was going to apply for a PhD program in the US in a specific date, and all of this just went to shit because the thesis project where I was working on, I was not being thoroughly advised. My advisor, at the beginning, just left the project without much justification. I had a lot of delays because I was doing clinical research with humans. And, you just become, every deadline that you have, it doesn't realistically happen. It just completely goes away. And so I had all of these things, and I also had relationship issues. All of this compounded, and I was also slacking off. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't really exploring my intellectual curiosities. I was just stuck in this loop of rumination and really worried about my academic career. And all of this stress compounded. And one day, I started having those same existential questions come back. And it's not that they ever really went away, but they came back with a different valence. And, they caught me at a time that I just was extremely vulnerable. And when those questions came, I just experienced a whole lot of resistance. I was just like, oh no, not this again. There's no way I'm going to go through all of that process that I had experienced before. And even though I had some level of knowledge, I also realized that part of my recovery was kind of a random occurrence because, like I told you, I had the big life stressor that kind of it reset my brain. And then I got help, but I never truly tackled these questions. And so even though I had some level of knowledge about them, they just came back strong. And the more I resisted, the more they grew. And I started doing those habitual patterns of thinking that I had done before. I started seeking reassurance. I started, This time I even started going into online forums searching about, is there an answer to solipsism? Is there a way to prove that my reality is real? Is there a way to fully perceive absolute reality? And so I was just going down this rabbit hole, and there was just a ton of resistance from my part. I really didn't want to practice acceptance. And at this time I was also doing talk therapy for other issues. And looking back, and this is very well detailed in the literature, I just didn't know it at the time, talk therapy can make your OCD much worse. And so I would have these sessions with my psychologist where she would try to kind of debate me on my questions. She would say, of course, this isn't a simulation, because a simulation cannot be as complex as our reality is. And of course, for me, this was all. Of course, these are not good arguments. These are bogus ways to try and tackle an issue, because these questions are, in their essence, you cannot really answer them. And so this just made my OCD far worse, because in some sense it just increased my resistance to these questions, and it just made me go for the path of greatest resistance. It was only later on when, in some level of despair, I also started doing medication again. I started doing an SSRI, and I started doing exposure therapy. And normally, and this is also detailed in the literature, exposure therapy isn't as efficient for OCD profiles that are more obsessive in nature, where the compulsion isn't that physical, when it's more a pure OCD thing. And so, but overall, at the beginning, it was an extremely hard thing to do, the exposure therapy, but I think it was one of the best decisions that I ever made, because doing exposure was so antagonistic to what I was doing before. It was such a completely different way of perceiving the issue. Because with exposure and response therapy, and for existential OCD, as they call it, one of the things you can do is, for instance, write a script about the trouble, about this existential question that you are fearing. So, for instance, what if I'm in a coma? You would write a script where you're detailing a situation where you really might be in a coma. And you really try to embrace the idea of maybe yes, maybe not. So you start practicing and building up tolerance to uncertainty. And that is what I truly believe is the biggest key to being and managing OCD. Of course, this isn't all there is to it, because you need to do more than just exposure. For some people, maybe not. I mean, this is not, some people just, can do exposure. Some people don't even do exposure, and somehow their brain recalibrates and they're able to just get on with it. I mean, this is what happened to me before. But when this happened again, part of me was in complete disbelief, because I had truly convinced myself that I was immune to these mental health crises, that I was, just resilient, that all of that was in the past. And so when it happened again, it just felt so defeating. But like I was saying, I started doing medication, an SSRI, and the exposure and response prevention therapy. And it took a while in order for me to start feeling the effects. But the combination of both of those, alongside mindfulness, and to be clear about this, mindfulness can be a form of exposure therapy, because if you just sit down and you allow your thoughts and emotions to just arise, then you are exposing yourself to part of the issue, which is the actual emotion. And this is why some authors talk about OCD being not just a thinking problem, but more so a feeling problem, because you are unable to feel the anxiety that comes with certain thought. and also because you are intrinsically labeling a certain idea or a certain situation with a fixed outcome. So, in my case, I was always perceiving uncertainty as being something that is truly bad and scary. That had just been imprinted in my mind, and that the only way for me to overcome that was to find some sort of answer and certainty. That obviously was never going to work. And so exposure therapy is a way that forces you to practice acceptance. Other people that have struggled and still struggle with existential OCD, and I should clarify that I still struggle with existential OCD and OCD in general. Sometimes it's just better to say OCD because there are a lot of different themes with OCD, and we just don't want. I think something that is a good practice is to try and simplify things and not add too much verbal content to them and too much concept. So I still struggle with OCD, and I have some bad days and I have good days, and some days are in the middle, but I think I'm much better than I was during those acute periods, which just, they are just simply hellish. They are pretty hard to go through. And so, just that combination of exercising, doing exposure therapy, and in my case, the medication, ended up being something that allows me to manage my OCD symptoms and allows me to have some resources when I truly am in a OCD episode, because sometimes it just hits when you are, especially when you are more stressed out and you have something going on in your life. OCD tends to strike a little bit harder in those situations. But having a commitment with yourself to intentionally and deliberately exposing yourself to your fears, I think, is a very good mentality to have. And this is not only true for OCD, it's true for everyone. Everyone, I think, should employ some of the aspects of exposure response prevention therapy in their lives, because it just gives you a different tool. It gives you such a different way of embracing life, because most people just try to avoid, and not really embrace uncertainty. I mean, we have a whole industry that is focused on, distracting us from the idea that we can die, that death is true. And so having that in mind, deliberately seeking your fears, for me, it has been probably the thing that has helped me the most, just doing that sort of exposure and response therapy. Talk therapy, I believe, can be harmful. I mean, I would like to know from you guys in the comments, maybe for some people struggling with OCD, it has actually been good. But I do believe that talk therapy promotes reassurance, and in my case, it just made me have a worse outlook on the issues that I was struggling with. It just made me more neurotic. It just made me stuck in that loop of psychoanalyzing my thoughts. So one of the things that normally attaches to existential OCD and health OCD is called responsibility OCD, which is where you start having these intrusive thoughts and worries that you're going to lose control, you're going to snap, go crazy, and do something that could be dangerous to yourself and others. And that is a terrible fear to have. It just is a struggle. It's horrible because all of these things are ego dystonic. And so it just goes against your values. And for me, as someone who was always worried about the well-being of others, having that fear in my mind that I can snap and hurt someone else, it just feels like hell. It's you have this devil on your shoulder that is telling you things and making you worried about certain situations, and you're just resisting that. You're just convincing yourself that will never ever be the case. And so, like any other OCD theme, exposure and response therapy is very good for this. Of course, there is always, to some extent, a lot of value in cognitive behavioral therapy in the case of OCD. So practicing a way to reshape your relationship with your thoughts is always something that is a worthwhile pursuit. And so CBT is also helpful for OCD, although I would argue that the exposure branch of it is the key element. There is also acceptance and commitment therapy. I have never tried that modality, but I know a lot of people that say that it has been extremely helpful, especially for existential OCD. Existential OCD is not just the things that I was talking to you about. It's also, the question of, is there meaning to life, and all of that. For me, the meaning of life question it never scared me too much. It never caused me to worry a lot about. And this is something that is extremely interesting and frustrating about OCD, which is its selectivity. So OCD selects fears that sometimes you have even related fears, but you only fear one component of it. And so OCD just focuses on one part of it. And it's interesting to ask why. Why is this the case? Of course, do not get into a loop of psychoanalyzing your OCD, but OCD really does have that version to it. And then there's, of course, always that component of OCD, which is called meta OCD, where you yourself, where you're questioning whether you even have OCD. So OCD is making you uncertain and questioning of whether you actually have OCD or if you actually have something else, something that could be worse. Are you going psychotic? Do you have schizophrenia? All of those thoughts come up with OCD. And this is a very natural reaction of just being anxious. Anxiety makes you feel that you might lose control because you're so overwhelmed with the mental contents of your mind, with the physical sensations that are going on. So you just become so focused on all of these questions that you're not able to, move on from this. And one thing that is also true about OCD that I also don't hear being mentioned a lot is the level of insight. Normally people say that OCD is a mental disorder with a good level of insight. And this is something that separates it from psychosis, for instance, where people have very low insight and they're indulging in their delusions or some thoughts in a way in which they are completely or very unaware that they are, adhering to something that is far from being the truth. And so I think with OCD, most people say that everyone with OCD has very good insight over their fears. But I think that's also not the case sometimes. I think there is always a level of true uncertainty. There's always a level, of course, that you may realize that what you're thinking about is absurd. But there's a part of you that is truly scared by it, that truly, is educating the possibility of that fear being true. Because if you didn't have that, if you just truly knew that what you're thinking about is truly ridiculous, then you probably wouldn't feel the anxiety that you're feeling. And normally I see people completely neglecting this part. And OCD has two sections to it. One of it is that the fears, and some people use this to separate generalized anxiety disorder from OCD, is that normally the OCD fears are wilder and more out there than with generalized anxiety disorder. But some fears of OCD are actually very grounded. They're just about really mundane things. And so I think OCD also has that spectrum, that horizon of, being a very abstract or out of their fear. And some of them are actually very, very instinctual, primal fears. So I think there's also that concept to it. And so I think overall OCD is like having a Twitter brain. You're just constantly receiving a lot of trash, a lot of, ideas that you cannot unlatch yourself from. You cannot distance yourself from these questions. And so for me at least, there are also two areas of intervention where I think one can find very useful to apply some degree of intention to. One of it is having conceptual tools. So having tools that are directed towards your thinking. And so I think even with OCD, because OCD is normally also attached to some level of depression, I think trying to reframe your thoughts, so actually questioning your thoughts in the sense of, why is this actually scary? why is it that I really need to know this? Why can't I just not know? So sometimes asking the question why can be very helpful, because why is a question that has a sort of ability to reset your brain, because it's such a big question that it can throw your OCD off. It can make it frustrated and kind of die off a little bit. So that part, having a conceptual framework to tackle OCD, can be very helpful. And then, of course, having non-conceptual methods, so methods that go into the underlying physiology of the disorder. So, doing practices that allow you to be healthier, mentally healthy. So doing resistance training, having strength training, endurance training, doing, having your mindfulness routine, having a relaxation routine that can allow you to sleep better, because a lot of times sleep also becomes an issue with OCD, and those who struggle with OCD have higher than normal rates of insomnia. And this can very quickly also become another OCD theme, where you develop sleep anxiety, sleep OCD, and then you just become very obsessed with all areas of sleep and health. And this just becomes a very big loop. So, just having that relaxation routine can be very helpful. Having a journaling practice can also be very helpful. Like I mentioned before in the video in this channel, Pennebaker's protocol of writing 15 minutes a day about a traumatic event or about something that is worrying you can be extremely beneficial. It can have very potent antidepressant effects. And if you feel less depressed, you won't cling on to these questions that much. Because a lot of these existential questions feed from an underlying sense of unsafety, a feeling that you are in danger because you cannot answer these questions, and that the not knowing is tainted with true danger. And so, if you are able to change your emotional state, you will very quickly realize that it's not really about the question. I've realized this so many times, because I've had periods where I'm actually deeply enjoying these questions, where I'm in a state where I'm, just finding them very interesting and actually believing that they can make my life better because they allow me to see things from a different perspective. But this is when I have this underlying sense of tranquility in my body for some reason, because I have been doing things, I have been exercising well, I have been sleeping well, I have been eating well. And so when I'm in that state, these questions sort of just are there, but they're not taking that space of fear. Other times, if you're feeling more stressed and anxious because of other things going on in your life, you will see that same question will bring upon a fear response, and you will not be able to dig deep into that sense of curiosity. And I truly believe that curiosity is an antidote to fear. Curiosity is the opposite of fear. Courage is not necessarily the opposite of fear. And so if you're able to have a curious outlook towards a lot of things that you're experiencing, so, even having a meditation practice that allows you to explore curiosity and questions around your own experience. So, for instance, asking yourself, how do I know that I am feeling anxious? And really feeling where in your body you are feeling that anxiety. That can be very helpful. With meditation around OCD, a lot of times you'll feel a lot of resistance to just sit down and experience whatever you're experiencing. But it is important to allow that resistance to just be, and to not try to do just, breath awareness. If you're having that resistance, just really feel that before. Allow that resistance to dissipate, and then move on to your main directed goal of the meditation practice. But so, in terms of these behavioral protocols that you can do, I think writing, journaling is very good. Mindfulness, like I told you, doing exercise. I think cold exposure is very good as well. I have been doing that for, now for around 4 months, and it gives you that antidepressant effect, just gives you a boost. And because you're going into cold water, it just allows you to be more focused on the present moment, more focused in the body. And a lot of times we just need to be more in the body and less in the head. I think something that is also true with a lot of mental health disorders, and I have realized this personally, actually, for the first time when I started having this episode, is that you become far more aware of yourself. Sometimes when you're struggling with OCD, your sense of self just grows very big. Your sense of self grows big, but your actual self, it just decreases inside. You just feel so little. You feel trapped in your own head. The borders of your body become more defined, and you just feel that you're totally in here and completely separated from the world. So I think for some of you, looking into the idea of non-duality, looking into some of those concepts can be a good way of exploring this issue. I think a modality of meditation that can be helpful is following Douglas Harding's method of having no head. You can look it up. I can put some links in the video in order for you to just check it out. I think it can be a helpful way of meditating because just like anything else, I think there are methods of meditation that are more appropriate for OCD than others. And so I think methods such as open awareness can be better than focused methods such as breath meditation, because sometimes you just need to be a little bit less aware of certain noisy stimulus, because OCD just packs you up with a lot of noise. And so you end up with a bad signal to noise ratio. And so overall, I think that this is a manageable condition. It can be very scary in the beginning because a lot of the fears that OCD brings upon you will just make you isolate yourself because you're afraid of sharing them. And this is why OCD also has one of the longest periods before actually seeking treatment along the mental health disorders. Because for some people, it's easier to ask for help if they're just feeling depressed than if they're afraid of what if none of this is real, or what is the meaning to life, and some of these more abstract questions. And also realizing that you're not alone in this, that there are other people around. And I know that you may have the solipsism theme with your OCD that will even make you question that. But at least from my part, I don't want to reassure you, but I can tell you that I'm actually here, that you're not alone. And just realizing that there are a lot of people struggling with this. OCD rates have been increasing. They're normally more common in early to late adolescence and young adulthood, even though OCD can also come up later, but it's very common to come up early on in life. But just realize this, that you're not alone, and that there are a lot of people struggling with this, and that there are a lot of good resources online that you can use to manage your OCD. And just realize that you have gone through a lot of difficult times in your life. You have gone through a lot of really hard moments, and you're still here. And so just really try to observe that inner strength that you have, and know that you're capable of handling this. This is just another issue. This is just another problem. And sometimes it can feel bigger than life. It can feel extremely hard to just keep floating on, keep breathing. But this is really one of those situations where you just need to put one foot in front of the other for just some time. And so be kind to yourself, have compassion, allow yourself to struggle. It is perfectly normal. Do not put a time limit on this. Do not try to not get very big expectations about, I need to be good in a week or two, and if this doesn't go away in a month, then I'm going to have this for the rest of my life. Just really allow yourself to, take your time, trust in the process, and do not be afraid of seeking help. And this is, in the end, this is a manageable condition. This is something that, although is classified as chronic, it can go away. And, just have that mindset towards life. And I know this is hard, and let me know in the comments how your experience has been, if you found this video to be helpful. And if you actually want me to do more videos on this topic, I would be very happy to do so and share more of the things that have helped me. I think I covered most of them, but I can go more in detail with this. And if you're also interested in me doing a neurobiology video on OCD, I would also be more than glad on doing that. So hopefully you found this useful, and just hang on in there, and we're in this together. Thank you.